On April 16th, 2025, the CVE program faced a critical juncture when its federal funding was set to expire, threatening to disrupt a system integral to global cybersecurity operations. In response, a coalition of veteran CVE board members established the CVE Foundation, a non-profit entity aimed at ensuring the long-term viability, stability, and independence of the CVE program. Although CISA stepped in to extend the CVE program's funding for 11 months, the CVE Foundation is still looking to take it over. This entire series of events caused some panic and understandable confusion in the community, especially with regard to the CVE Foundation themselves. I reached out to the Foundation and asked to interview them to try and get their take on the current status of the CVE program, what their plans are, and why they think it will work better in their hands. Today, I'm joined by Pete Allor, a longtime leader in cybersecurity with decades of experience at Red Hat, IBM, and Honeywell. He's a current member of the CVE board, led national cybersecurity efforts, and helped build some of the most important security frameworks we rely on today. Pete's influence spans vulnerability management, incident response, and sector-wide collaboration at the highest levels. I really hope you enjoy this interview. Pete, welcome to my channel. Thanks for speaking with me today. For people who might not know who you are, what CVEs are, and why they're so important, could you give us a brief overview?
So a little bit about me. I've been in the security industry for 25 years now. I started with a little company called Internet Security Systems, and we were one of the original board members of the CVE program back in 1999. So I've had association and interaction with CVE since that. CVE, Common Vulnerability Exposures. What it really is a system to enumerate all vulnerabilities. And from the perspective I have and from my employer, we assign a CVE number for every vulnerability there is. It doesn't matter whether it's a critical or a low, it deserves to be enumerated. Why? Simply, everyone needs to be able to identify it. If we have a question about it, we should be able to refer to it from a common way. And if you look back in the old days, I can't believe I'm actually going to say that, but we had things like the VU number from CERT, we had the bug track ID, we had X-Force ID, and we were doing numerous different ways and trying to catalog them. That was just onerous. So that came about. So where am I in this entire system? I happen to be a CVE board member underneath the CVE program that is currently sponsored by CISA, an agency underneath the Department of Homeland Security. As a member of the board, I work on how we govern through the vulnerabilities, how we work that through. In my full-time work, I'm an employee of Red Hat, and we happen to be a CVE naming authority, or CNA, for both Red Hat properties, that's our scope, and for the Fedora project. So we support an upstream project. We also happen to be a root CNA. There are 6 of them. So if there's 453 CNAs, the federation isn't the CNAs. The federation is the ability to help govern through that entire ecosystem, I'll call it. It's not an ecosystem by itself. It's a sub-element. And the roots give governance to the CNAs that are under them. And they help adjudicate some of the things. Then you have a CNA LR. So if there's 6 roots, of the 6, 2 are non-government. The rest are governments, plural. And then CNA LRs, there are 3. So it takes a little bit to work up through that process. And CNA LR is the last resort. It's supposed to help adjudicate and technically work through problems for the roots. And then you have the top level roots. There are 2. There are MITRE and CISA. MITRE has generally everyone. CISA has everything in the industrial control system space. So you can see that there is a way to work through and help bring that together. That all is part of the program, and it has a CVE board, currently 22 members. Some are government, several are CISA, one is from MVD, he represents NIST. But each organization only gets a vote. So you can have a couple people, but who's there representing your vote is the real question. So that's the program. And you would expect all software producers to be a CNA. That is not exactly true. We're trying to grow that. And more importantly, what we're trying to do is give a way to work that so that no one entity has to carry that load. If one entity is doing 453, then is anyone getting service is the question. And that's the real issue, because there are questions. As a CNA Allor, we did our first adjudication just 3 weeks ago. We've only been a CNA Allor since March. So, there are issues that people need help with. Everyone always needs help. The question is, who do you go to? And that's the federation part. So I think that kind of answers that part.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So, as you said, the CVE project currently run by MITRE. It's funded by the US government, something that your organization, the CVE Foundation, have described as a single point of failure. I think the events of the last few weeks have illustrated that quite well. Your plan is to be funded by multiple stakeholders to prevent this in the future. So my question is, what does that multi-stakeholder funding model look like in practice? And how are you going to ensure transparency and accountability in that funding?
Good questions. First of all, I've worked on several nonprofit boards. And as a board director and officer of those organizations, I've helped work through. For instance, the IT Sector Coordinating Council, I was both the treasurer and the vice chair. For FIRST, I was the CFO for a number of years. Every nonprofit has to do a declaration, is Form 990N. In there, it says what the board was working on. It talks about what monies were taken in, what they're allocated for, how much was administrative overhead, things of that nature. And it talks about your major projects. The tendency for all those boards is to answer to the membership about what they do, what their intents are. Most of those organizations actually have an annual plan. They have a multi-year plan. And so you talk about what your goals and vision are, and you allow people to participate and say, I think this is a worthy project. As you work that worthy project forward, you would then show how you develop it and produce it for everyone to use. In the case of CVE, it's a matter of how do we guide the cornerstone of the vulnerability ecosystem? And that is the naming of the vulnerabilities. And how do we federate that out? The federation would be broader. So you have to look, there's two parts then. One is CVEs, how do you administer it in the current federation model? How do you continue that? And we looked, that would stay the same. And then how would everyone be able to contribute so that no one party has sole vote of direction or accountability? We become accountable to all the stakeholders. So it's by an open process, becoming more transparent, taking in the needs of the global vulnerable ecosystem and serve that. There's no rejection of anyone's particular aspect. But if you look at bits and bytes don't have a tendency to be solely on one sovereignty or another. Bits and bytes don't care where they are. So if you look at it, you can have a pond or you can have the ocean. And like all territories abut the ocean, you have your territorial waters. But the larger part is in the ocean, and everyone needs to transit that. And that's where the vulnerabilities are. So you look at the territorial waters, your critical infrastructure and how you're protecting it. But most of your critical infrastructure is still run on bits and bytes. I would postulate that if you're doing infrastructure protection, you're actually taking care of your critical infrastructures, and you don't have to worry about what you want to classify as a government. All the governments do that. They all talk about how they're going to protect that. Why aren't we just addressing the vulnerabilities globally? And if it happens to be in your critical part, we don't need to know that. Governments want to know that maybe, but that's different. That's a government on government problem set. From an ecosystem, we all are running the same code. And if you look at it, more and more adopting open source and proprietary, and that requires collaboration. It requires communication. And you have to have a basis of that communication. You have to have a commonness to that entire approach. So the goal is the commonness of the approach. Now it's a matter of how do you ensure that it's robust? It's not in one single point of failure from an infrastructure perspective. It's not one server, it's multi-servers. It's mirrored in multiple locations. And it's robust enough that everyone can pull from, which allows everyone also to contribute to. If you look at the JSON 5 that CVE has, that was written in an open source manner. My organization that I'm employed by contributed heavily to that in that entire process. But the code is open. So we want that so it has open transparency. Everyone can pull. Now we need to, everyone can contribute and everyone can help set what is the direction. You enact that through a board and you just eliminate the fact that if party A gives 5 figures and party B gives 7 figures, well, they're contributing to the overall success. Their donation doesn't incur, I have a larger vote. So it should be industry-led. It's an industry problem set, but there are governmental concerns. And all governments have concerns. We need to help address their concerns. But it has to be every government.
Right.
So that's our goal and intent. There are some mechanisms you have to do behind that. We're still working on the mechanisms. But the goal is to allow governments to participate, to allow continue with CISA and MITRE. They have their needs. ANISA and all the nation states in the EU have their needs. And by the way, there's still Africa and Asia. So quite frankly, how do we serve everyone's needs? Because the bits and bytes, once they traverse off your system, they're everyone's problem.
Yeah. So as a quick follow-up, I know a few people are obviously concerned about funding because the CVE Foundation sort of came about a lot because of the funding issues that MITRE had. So one question I know a lot of people will be asking is, well, okay, so you say that you obviously want multiple companies, organizations, even governments to help fund you. Do you have any solid commitments at all at this point, or is that still a ways off?
Well, actually, we were surprised. Of course, the timing was not something that we were envisioning at all. We just didn't see this one coming. We saw challenges to the system. We didn't see the issue that brought it to the fore. But it happened, okay? So now people are talking about it. And that's a good conversation. People should talk about it. They should wonder about it. They should ask for an action plan. And they deserve one. We've had several governments, okay, a handful, who have indicated a willingness to participate. We've had foundations, philanthropics, lots of private sector across the continuum. I mean, it's amazing. It really is indicative of everyone wants to have an open system. Everyone wants it to work. They need it. So that's the encouraging part. When we looked at dollars that people were offering, and some exceed probably the requirement. That's mind-blowing, mind-blowing. And we do realize there's a startup transition part, and then there's ongoing operations, and then there's growth. And so notice that we put that in 3 buckets. There is a transition you have to set up. There is an ongoing current operations. We believe that it can be done at a much more rapid pace to meet needs and thought out needs. And then there's growth. What does the system do in broad? And that's open for a lot more input and setting the priorities as you look forward. Because in reality, people are looking for a robust aggregator at the same time, which also had funding problem sets.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I think I saw a lot of people when the whole funding issue came up with the CVE program was like, oh, I didn't realize it was so heavily funded by the US government. Why is it funded so heavily by the US government? So there was definitely a large amount of surprise that something that is really a global initiative, is so tied to one country and one country's government at that.
Yes. And like all governments, there are budgeting cycles. And when I say cycles, the budget cycle itself, but there's also cycles to how funding works or duration of that. And you certainly have seen that with the American government. And it changes periodically. It's not necessarily by administration, although by administration, there are flavors to it. But there's, economic concerns that a government goes through. All governments go through that. That's just life. I don't control it, I just have to acknowledge it. If that is in fact something that happens, and I'll just say this is not the first time this has had a problem, okay? Meaning for just MITRE, we can talk about other parts, then those are very real. If they're very real, then everyone else is dependent upon that problem set is not a good plan. It's like any corporate entity doesn't have one stream of income. Because if that product is out of vogue, guess what? There is no corporation. So, everyone has to evolve, and it's time for the program to evolve. And that's where, if you look at it as CVE board members, our concern is at. We've seen that. And I think we need to be accounted for, hearing what we know. We're very upfront. We're very close to the issue. Hence why we're trying to move past that and account for the global approach. And I don't want it to sound trite, because that's not the way we see it. But we do see that it is a global challenge and a global need. And we have to start talking to that, address those concerns, because they're real. Okay? As I stated to some friends in a forum last week, Europe shouldn't commit the American mistake. Think about that. Sole funding, doing it from one problem, taking care of a country or a region, is not the way we need to address this. If you look at it from a security vendor, which I've been a security vendor before, where do I go for the data, and how do I portray it to customers, and how do I actually answer their question? If you look at it from a customer, I was a customer prior to coming to my current employer, and I'm not speaking for my employer. I looked at it. How do I get real information? How do I know how I address this? How do I get my risk? Vulnerabilities are not a risk individually. One vulnerability is not a risk. It helps you understand the level of your risk based on how you deploy things and what you're using. So it's a component. But as a software producer, how do I convey that? There has to be a common language for that. And that's what CVE provides, is what's that vulnerability. When you add the rest of the vulnerability information to it, you now come into an ecosystem. And I'd ask you this, because at VulnCon 2025, I asked this in the opening ceremony. What is a Vuln ecosystem? Show me a diagram. Show me a workflow. Show me a data flow. It's happenstance. So I asked at the closing, what are we doing for changing this for next year? What do we accomplish by the various elements? And so I asked people in CVSS to come out with 4.1. I asked the people over in Oasis CSAF, can you upgrade to 2.1? Now, I will admit, I was there at the start of CVSS version 1 when it was underneath the NIAC. It got transferred to first. Notice it went from government to a nonprofit. I was there when ICASI created CVRF. I was part of that group that created ICASI and created CVRF, and then moved across to Oasis and changed the name to CSAF. The name changed because the government wanted to have all our vulnerabilities in advance. We can name them, but getting all that information, sorry, that's a government problem set. But who owns the problem? Industry owned the problem. So those were targets. What did CVE raise his hand up about? That we would fix CPE some more with NBD and get Perl added. Why? Because it's open source components and everyone needs that. So I think this is Pete's personal opinion. It has nothing to do with the CVE board or anyone else's, although we've talked about on the CVE board, is we, the global ecosystem, need to come up with a better idea in how we operate and collaborate. You can't do that from a government.
Yeah.
You need industry to lead. You can influence by saying, we have a requirement we would like to see. And if we answer all governments, we can prioritize that as well as meeting customer needs. Whose problem is it anyways? It's really industry's. So why not is industry leading it? That's the real question.
Yeah, that's valid. It kind of leads into my next question, though. I don't imagine what the answer will be here, but let's just say, assuming that the CVE Foundation does take over the CVE program, what are either your personal or the CVE Foundation's sort of long-term vision for the program over the next 5 to 10 years, and how is that going to differ from the direction MITRE's taken?
So MITRE is a FFRDC that works for CISA, Federally Funded Research and Development Corporation. It's not supposed to do operations. So we have to help that out. We need to have real operations. The reason that the CVE board works with the first board in co-hosting VulnCon, because we see that there's a need for incident response and CVE to work together. That VulnCon was to bring all the disparate parts from CWE to EPSS to CVSS to coordinated disclosure, PCERTs, into the same room. what everyone liked about the conference last year and this year is, hey, we are all in the same Vuln business from different aspects. We've never had anything that was focused on what we do. We started to have scanning vendors there, so that was another element. Next year's intent, and you have to realize I'm also the organizer, okay, is to bring customer segment to that. The end user, what is his problem? If we're not solving his problem, hello, what are we doing? An academic exercise. This is about solving problems. We got to focus on the problem. You have to hear from everyone who has a part in that play. And so from a CVE program perspective, how do we get there? And I think first we'll probably have its own commentary. I've spoken with them. They were at the conference. They're a co-host. Having been on the first board and knowing the mission, I'm pretty sure that they're in that same vein of how do we answer a global problem? Even though most of them are C-cert in nature versus P-cert, we're in the same problem set. How do we get rid of risk? How do we identify it? So I think that's an opportunity. Where it goes, I couldn't tell you. But we're talking. That's the interesting part. You're seeing lots of people starting to postulate different ideas. Mm-hmm. Some of them I think are right on. Some are partially on. Some are personal proclivities to go off and do weird things where it can't happen. And it's like, you don't know until you try.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good answer. So possibly a controversial subject, but the CNA program, I think, has been largely successful. I know there are some people in the industry, though, that are concerned by what I'm just going to term rogue CNAs that don't appear to be taking CVEs seriously. What, if any, are the CVE Foundation's plans to ensure that CNAs actually operate in good faith, and how might the CNA model change?
Wow. Before all this hit the public airwaves, I'll call it, at the end of VoneCon, which was the week before last, okay, the CVE board met, and we spoke to some of that, and we postulated some ideas and ways forward. So one of the talks generated some thought. I'm going to credit Jay Jacobs and Art Mannion for putting a talk together about, I think it was CV or MVVE. I have to check on the acronym. But what they were talking about was the minimum elements for a CNA. Now, this kind of dovetailed to some other thoughts and conversations. And by day 2, I started to realize that, we should probably think about, are there levels or tiers of CNAs? What's the expectation? And we need to enforce that expectation. So as you do that, great. Let's help everyone understand what that is. There's a list on the MITRE site about, who's, recognition of CNAs. What's it take to be on that list? Is that the standard we really want? Is there a higher level standard where they do enrichment? What is an ADP, an additional data provider? I think there's 2 levels of that. So that was the conversation we had at the board meeting about what should we do. In the board meeting, I'll describe it as very strategic and thought, which was good. We need that. The whole purpose behind that strategic thought is really what we're talking as part of the CVE Foundation. We need to be more strategic, not just a tactical element of, how we're going to do JSON 5. That's what we have working groups for. So it's a matter of changing that governance, which was an act of thought prior to all this, which dovetails where the thoughts were about some of the board members we ought to be thinking. And we did it organically. So that's on the table of how do we better enable CNAs. Do we know that some CNAs are rather quiet? Yeah. Should they become CNAs? Well, I think CNA counts, saying that we have 453 is not a really good thing. We don't have 453 quality CNAs.
Right.
We recognize that. But we got to get rid of we have a great big number, because that's not success. Success is quality. And maybe we have to define levels of quality. Maybe you don't need to be a CNA. You can go to a root and get a CVE. We don't do blocks anymore. I watched somebody who was talking about blocks of CVEs. That doesn't work anymore. You can get them right on the fly. We built the infrastructure to do that. So I think there's a little bit of what are we doing now? What's the capability and what's quality? And that's a conversation we need to have. And it needs to be a broader conversation.
So obviously, yeah, you mentioned CNAs that are rather quiet. The one that I think most people will think about when I use the term rogue CNA is the Linux Foundation, right? Basically, who got made a CNA, I believe it was last year or the year before.
February last year, yes.
Right. And have sort of started filing CVEs for absolutely every single pull request commit to the Linux kernel. Like, how do we fix that?
So let's talk about that because, that may have been an intent. It was something that was discussed. I saw on different lists, okay? And the CVE board spoke with the kernel, okay? It wasn't Linux Foundation, it was the kernel. And we said, okay, let's go ahead and have you be a CNA. As a root, I hold a work group session that started out as the Linux flavors with the kernel. We've been meeting now for almost a year, monthly. We've changed that to open source software CNAs. So we broadened it and we've invited a lot of others and they're coming. What did I discover? Well, because I was talking with everyone, I started to learn something. And kernel had a challenge because they had a lot of backed up things and they weren't enumerated. So I'm not going to say everything by the kernel is the way I would have wanted it. They went from 50 to 35 to 4,800 and a couple CVEs over the last 3 years. And they're on a pretty good pace this year. It's a challenge for a lot of us in the Linux distributions. When I'm talking Ubuntu and, SUSE, Canonical, Red Hat, Oracle Linux, Microsoft. Most people wouldn't think we all get together, but we did. And we have Greg there, and he's participating more and more. So we're starting to understand some of his problem. As a root, I'm hearing from a couple CNAs their challenge. It has to do with data quality, or what people call data quality. And this is the problem about not being well defined, is do they really assign a CVSS? I know 3 different, include kernels, so kernel's not alone, that's probably not the right idea. Think about that for a second. I'm just saying maybe we don't have that right. So maybe I change governance that allows for these upstream communities that they don't do that. Now the question comes to enrichment. Maybe the Linux flavors need to do enrichment of that. Or maybe the Linux flavors as a group do enrichment for on a higher level as a group. And then they start to add CVSS. Because it's not until you put it into the kernel do you know what it is. Obviously, take the kernel, put it into the operating system, do you know what it is? So I think we have things upstream that people haven't considered, which is the reason my employer became a root and became an Allor. Yes, I did play in that, but I have to separate the two and what I'm answering here. So we decided or understanding that we need to change. Well, the program needs to hear that. They need to hear it better because there is a challenge and we need to address it. Because when I have somebody downstream me says, hey, they just dropped 731 CVEs. How many, you're affected by all these, you got to give me answers the next day. Okay. A little bit of a challenge. So, we have to work through that. When I look at that number, a very small number affected Red Hat, in a significant manner. No criticals, a couple importance, a lot of moderates. So, when I talk to, my counterparts over at SUSE or Oracle Linux, they're in the same boat. But I have a more robust sized team. So we have to be able to inform everyone how this really works, and we have to mutually support each other. And I think that's the opportunity of the program for the future. That's the growth part.
Yeah.
And we need that. So were they rogue? We'll leave that as an open question. Are they adapting? Yes, they are. And I say that because I actually seen places, or I've heard Greg say, you ought to go and talk to Red Hat. They can help you. They're a root. Maybe they could help me and be the ADP for my stuff. Stop thinking about that conversation. In 1 year's time, what do? We heard each other. How do we hear each other? We met regularly. We met as a group. We talked through problems. Are we there yet? No, I think we got room to go. And I think everyone will admit that. But I'm looking at how we help these communities in the program. That's what a root's supposed to do. And that's why we need more non-government routes. That's real federation, not the number of CNAs. And by the way, not all CNAs contribute or have contributed anytime of late. So do we know there's the challenge here? Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad to hear your perspective on that, because I think, I mean, I'm probably biased. We only see, I think, a lot of the complaints. Let's just say that. So it's good to hear some of the, let's say, behind the scenes stuff, especially if there have been productive conversations with the Linux kernel. And apologies for misspeaking, not the Linux Foundation, but yeah, Linux kernel team.
And you know, they're a small team, and they've got a lot of things there. You know, they do it their way. My way is a little bit different. But if we're going to help anyone, we need to be more open, and we have to allow for what they're doing. But more importantly, we have to engage with them to help them learn how the system works. And that's what the kernel team is learning. Okay, they've changed some, we've changed some. That's good.
Okay, so this is a question from 4 and 5 Lady on X. How will you balance speed versus accuracy when disclosing emerging vulnerabilities, especially in cloud native and ephemeral environments?
Oh, wow. See, CVE is one thing, CVD is another. Remember I said there's an ecosystem and it's not well defined? What's the interplay? Because there is a lot of interplay. Back in 2004, we published the NIAC Vulnerability Disclosure Guidelines. Okay, that's actually what drove CVSS to be developed, just so, you know, put a little history in there, although we kicked CVSS out in 2003. The problem about coordination has to do with where are the parties. I would postulate, this is Pete's experience, I'm talking to a couple others, that we have ill-defined coordinated vulnerability disclosure, that there are actually levels of what you do. And we call all CVD like it's all one great big thing. I'm sorry, there's actually a lot of sub-elements in there, especially when you start looking at BIOS and firmware, or you look at kernel issues. How do you disclose that? You know, and depending upon the community, they have different disclosure timelines because of the way that community works. So what works over here may not work over here the same way. There has to be coordination between us to do that. This is another reason why, when you talk about coordinated vulnerability disclosure, governments can't be involved, okay? Why do we use governmental assets at this point? Is when it's a real big thing and it takes a lot of bodies, we just shuffle off. We've done that for years. We know that in the industry. So, you know, we're working through these things. There are different timelines. A CVE is a challenge there because where some assign their CVEs. So I would say, do we need to make it one way or do we make it two ways? I think it has to be discussed. Because I could see maybe there's a difference. We've never written it because we don't break it down exactly. There's plenty of work here. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I get excited about it because I love what I do. But these are things that some of us are talking about, and I think we need to relook it.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Pete, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for representing the CVE Foundation on this quick Q&A.
Yeah, it was quick, but there's a lot here. So I appreciate the opportunity, and maybe we can talk again sometime in the future.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Thank you.